All right. Hello and welcome to the Opinionated Experience, the show where we discuss how to drive business impact through software, human-centered design, digital transformation, and more with leaders who want to get stuff done. Whether you're a product owner, an operational leader, or an IT professional, this show is for you. It's about getting to enterprise software that works and works well. The OX is about being bold and opinionated in your design, processes, and the way you work in the digital world. That's because the most effective people and experiences are not neutral. They lead with vision, a vision of where you should go as a person, as a user, and as a team. The OX is a place to explore these visions and help you get stuff done. I'm Matt Brown, and I've been in sales, solutions, product, and marketing in the B2B SaaS world for the past 10 years. And with me today, we've got Ashleigh, Holt, and Evan Roth. Welcome, Ashleigh and Evan. Thank you for joining us. Let's take a second. If you could just introduce yourselves, what you do here at Squid, and your connection to the PubSec world.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. Hi, everybody. I'm Ashleigh Holt. I'm a senior customer success manager here at Squid. I've been in the federal kind of go-to-market place for over 10 years, building relationships with senior government leaders, helping them solve solutions, discover their pain points with COTS technology. How can they extend their requirements and meet that in the technology space? So it's been a wild ride. I've been working in the DoD and intelligence space for most of my career. Worked in cybersecurity, low-code analytics, and now user experience and user interface here at Squid. So it's
Awesome.
been a great adventure.
Now you're a PubSec. You've been in the space for a while, so you're familiar with TLAs. But there's a lot of folks that might not. You use the phrase COTS. Can you just define COTS real quick?
Sure. I was definitely had a reminder to make sure I talk slow and spell out those TLAs. COTS is a commercial off-the-shelf solution. But yes,
Awesome.
commercial offering.
Yes, we will definitely come back to that topic for sure. Very cool. All right, and then Evan.
Hey everyone, my name is Evan Roth. I'm a public sector account executive here at Squid. Been here for just over a year running some of our top accounts in federal and looking at aerospace and defense next. In a previous life, I was first in the US Air Force as a special operations pilot, so I was one of your most angsty users that was giving feedback on user experiences.
Awesome.
And then I got to move into the private sector at a large aerospace enterprise organization where then I thought things would be a lot greener. Turns out not so much. So made my way here to Squid and been getting to see both worlds.
Awesome. Well, we are thrilled to have you at Squid, and it's been great working with you on some of these projects. So excited to get into this today. The reason that we're talking here is that over the past few years, we've seen some surprising innovation come from the public sector. But before we get into that, let's lay out the setting first and start with the problems that people are trying to solve. So what are the challenges and limitations that you're seeing a lot of these PubSec leaders face today?
Yeah, so there's so many buzzwords in the federal space. I totally cut out. Am I on time?
Yeah, you're coming through.
Okay, great.
Yeah, you're great.
No, I think where you're seeing a lot of challenges in the federal space are, I'm in it every day, so I feel like I hear these challenges a lot. But commercial off-the-shelf COTS solutions may not meet the need and mission of our government workforce. The government workforce does a great job of being a steward of our taxpayer money, which is great. I think that's something near and dear to all of our hearts. And so how can they meet their complex requirements with solutions that may need to be extended, whether that's security wise, whether that's experience wise, scalable. And then they're met with hardships like long acquisition cycles. So by the time you define the requirement, you find the solution you that meets the need, working with integrators or a development extension of your team to develop that out to meet the requirement, go through the acquisition cycle. Now the requirements changed. So that's a big one. And can that be solved? To be determined. The other, I think, too, is, one of the other buzzwords is digital transformation. What does that mean to senior leaders? Sounds great. It's a hard hard concept to task or to tackle. But I think what we're seeing now is in an effort to transform digital experiences, really what we're doing is modernizing and translating these experiences. Whether that's legacy processes that are mostly paper, PDF, um, and digitalizing those, whether that's migrating from legacy, database or systems of record, that's not easy. These are records, these are personnel records, or any record. And so there's this digital transformation versus digital translation. And those seem to be the biggest trends that I see right now, and kind of where they butt heads a little bit.
Awesome. Yeah, I've uh, that contrast between translation and transformation is an interesting one, I think, because yeah, like in other words, there's no value that's being added with the translation. Like you're not actually developing it. You're not making the workflow more valuable in the process of what you're turning it into. It's just one-to-one translation. And yeah, I'm in like right now, I know that everyone is over the past 2 weeks, with all the AI developments, it's like 3 weeks ago feels like ancient history. So that idea of like just doing a one-to-one translation is just not an option when the landscape is constantly changing. Yeah, excellent. Well, all right. So Evan, what about you? What are some of the challenges and limitations that you're seeing PubSec leaders face?
Yeah, I think the ultimate bottom line is you have a very accountable organization trying to roll out an application or a whole platform to a minimum of 500,000 users at a time. And when you do something like that and, ultimately try and make
Yes.
something that has to work very effectively, has to be accessible, has to be built in-house sometimes, it's really challenging. And, uniquely when we compare to the private sector, a lot of times these organizations really are held up, in the federal government by the president's office as to what has to be available, what has to be rolled out from day one. And to be able to accomplish that with the resources given, timelines, personnel, it's really challenging. And in a lot of ways, that pressure has turned things into diamonds in a way, right? Where you find that because they were upheld to that after a year, then it turns out you got something awesome that was well researched and designed. And then sometimes it doesn't. And they got funding for about a tenth of what they needed. We couldn't explain value to stakeholders. And ultimately, it's the citizen or client that suffers in the end until it can be fixed. So a lot of unique challenges just in the bottom line when you're rolling out to that many people.
Yeah, and then you got to roll it out to 500,000 Evan Roths that are going to give you feedback. Yeah, absolutely. Well, so okay, so that's a good sketch of the landscape, um, and I think you know where we go next stems from I think what we've seen, which is that uh, that limitation actually leads to some interesting results. So, like you said, sometimes it leads to diamonds with the pressure. And at Squid, of course, we would like to see it, that pressure lead to diamonds more often than not. And so I think there's this question of how is that limitation then actually leading to innovation. And so in your experience, um, how are PubSec teams overcoming those challenges to then create great employee experiences? And so I guess a little more context before we get into that, because there's I think there's probably some stereotypes in terms of private sector versus public sector. Let me backtrack a second before we get into that question. What are some of the stereotypes, maybe for those who don't know, in terms of PubSec versus private sector and their relationship to technology?
Um,
I would actually say first year, in terms of my expectations, like I mentioned, coming from a government user to the private sector, is that everyone thinks, oh, it's the private sector. They'll definitely have it more together than the government. Absolutely not true at times. You still have some very large enterprises with over 100,000 people organizing all their partner work on Excel spreadsheets emailed back and forth to each other. You have MS-DOS systems still in place when you could be using something actually in the cloud that people can share and experience. And things are so fragmented that it's really hard to, as a stakeholder, say, hey, I need to spend X amount of money to totally overhaul a system that some people are actually okay with working in Excel for a partner portal.
Ashleigh, you were going to say something too.
Yeah.
What? Tell me about the
I mean,
stereotypes that
there's
you've interacted
certainly
with there.
spaces where you still have to show connectivity to mainframes. And I don't, we're probably not going to get away from that. And that's scary. But otherwise, I mean, civil servants are men and women in the military, are human, and they want the same experiences as well. So the stereotypes are, Jane Smith, John Doe show up to work, their salary is paid for by the government. They should be okay with just what's acceptable or what's MVP, and then go home and are, robots. And that's really not the case. I, they, everyone is looking for a better, more intuitive experience to help them do their job faster, more collaborative, and ultimately meet the mission, whatever that mission is.
And that is where it's near and dear to the heart of Squid and our mission here is humanizing digital work. And I think that's great to call out, and it's something that we want for everyone, regardless of if you're doing government work, if you're doing work at an enterprise company, at a small business. We want work to be dignified, and that means that the applications that we use, they should humanize and not dehumanize us. So I think that's great to call out, and I wanted to start there because I think those stereotypes help kind of frame this a bit. Because again, the reason that we're here is we're actually seeing PubSec lead the way in some of these areas. And so, in your experience, let's go back to that question again. In your experience, how is PubSec overcoming these challenges and actually leading the way to create great employee experiences? And what can private sector learn from what PubSec is doing there?
I think the limitation that they have around maybe the tools available to them, security, et cetera, wise, is really driving, and you mentioned this earlier, Matt, innovation. It's forcing people or having people, giving people the flexibility to think outside of the box with what they have, and really offer amazing experiences with solutions that you may not think about in the way that they're intended for. When I was on the sales side of the house, I used Salesforce for forecasting as a CRM solution. Translating that into an experience platform for men and women, and using HR applications, et cetera, is really amazing. And then extending that as well. So I think you're seeing a lot of innovation with kind of blinders on, in a way. These men and women are going out and doing their market research. They know what industry standards are, and they're doing a great job of bringing folks in from the industry to consult and provide, best of breed guidance and human-centered design and user interface and et cetera. But it's really kind of paring down also some of the distractions out there as well. So.
That is a great call out, because I think I know when I've worked with certain platforms or ecosystems, and when you're looking for tools to accomplish a certain job, and you go and you look at the catalog of what's available, if there's like 150 different templates or tools to pick from, that can be really paralyzing. But if you tell someone, hey, here's the problem we need to solve, you've got these 3 tools you can use. Like, that could be very, very effective when you have those kinds of limitations in place. So yeah, that's great to hear. Evan, what have you seen? How are PubSec leaders solving for these challenges and limitations?
Yeah, I would say especially as part when it gets to, you talk about a budget or, a first year proof of concept and implementation. A lot of times when you have that, large pocketbook there, you're going to spend a year, 2 years, maybe just getting advice on how to do things, paying quite a bit of money and some setup that then does that actually lead to rapid execution? Instead, we see when you have a limited 1 year basis with X amount of probationary funding, you start seeing rapid prototyping. You start seeing hey, what can you do for me in 6 months right now, and actually prove what you're able to accomplish before we take the next step. And that starts weeding out, the weaker players that aren't able to accomplish that on either the limitations of the platform or the relationship ahead that the government's really signing up for on a 5-10 year basis. So it's definitely harder to see that experimentation and engagement when people are more familiar with, we're just going to get you the baseline application and you employees will have to deal with it.
So does that mean that PubSec leaders are looking more for, um, you know, sets of tools as opposed to point solutions that are going to be able to allow for that kind of long-term experimentation and those kinds of cycles?
I would say in particular, as part of the digital transformation efforts, they are trying to look at how do we make sure all these disparate data systems can go into one flexible either platform or ecosystem that can then be accessible to others to continue the same work.
So yeah,
So
building for interoperability and which let's go back to the technology for a second, because Ashleigh, you mentioned Salesforce, and Squid has been in the Salesforce space for basically a decade now. Um, and I think that's one of the things where a lot of the time, going back to stereotypes in private sector world, a lot of folks see Salesforce and they think CRM. Or they might think of one of the products that you can get, with Marketing Cloud or something like that. But that's how they think of it. And so you mentioned that in PubSec. So how are PubSec leaders using Salesforce to do this digital
Yeah, I
innovation that
think
you're
it's
seeing?
helping leaders, when you talked about that digital transformation and digital translation, migrate from legacy systems that are not interoperable, that are very expensive to maintain. And so, the benefits of moving into a COTS SaaS solution like a Salesforce provides the same robust database foundational framework, but also then allows more interoperability at scale and speed, which is really important. The modern government worker isn't working in a office any longer. They have the needs like any private sector company or employee would have, whether that's working from home, whether that's working in the field. And so you're seeing Salesforce come in to replace these legacy systems, a lot of times back of house, HR, employee experience, personnel records, etc., and allowing them to do that quickly and create a more foundational relational database. And then Salesforce has a great, ISV network. So to extend that and to create that customized experience, um, really provides a lot of flexibility for the government worker, which has been really fantastic to see in action.
Yeah, and I from personal experience, I started out in sales. I don't come from a code background. And Salesforce was a fantastic platform for me to learn about business software, because there was so much that I could do, even in sales and just learning the product. So I could learn Squid and learning to talk about it. There was so much that I could do in terms of building an app, even just working in CRM. And when you think about those limitations and how stringent requirements often are in PubSec for limiting the amount of custom code, that ability to have robust applications on an already FedRamped platform. Salesforce doesn't matter if people think of it as a CRM. It's got all the ingredients that you need in order to do that. So all right, so there's the technology piece, where it's not necessarily what you would expect. You're using Salesforce, thought of as a CRM, but you're actually using it for employee experience. You're using it for things like time entry. You're using it as your custom application development platform. So there's that technology piece. But Evan, you were talking also about the process side and kind of getting into this mindset of constant experimentation, building an MVP, then iterating instead of getting sucked into like a really, really long cycle. So I almost feel like there's the technology, but there's also that kind of that psychology of it. There's a way of approaching technology across an organization. So what are some of the things with regard to that, Evan, that you've seen in PubSec, and Ashleigh, maybe you have some anecdotes as well in terms of how they're going after the process side of it, and maybe changing paradigms for how they think about delivering value on a platform, delivering software applications.
Yeah, ultimately, we've seen a pretty great transformation over the past few years at some of our largest customers when they start thinking about a whole ecosystem of boutique applications on a platform, and then how to wrap around data from other data sources into those same applications. And that really elevates to, first of all, kind of to the previous points we made. You're not going to have a sea of people that know custom code, that are software developers, making market rate. We have a lot of government employees at rates that are not looking to have that kind of expertise. So to be able to empower them to build, it means their imagination is more unlocked into the art of the possible, versus looking, as we kind of mentioned, at a variety of different custom code promises, I'll call them, that maybe after a year and release, you realize was nothing like what you expected and you didn't get to rapidly prototype it. So we're seeing the government here in particular have actual employees helping build, helping test more accessibly, where they can actually see the building blocks in the back and say, oh, hey, I'd actually like to move this over here with real data instead of, ultimately something like a
Yeah.
Figma.
I think too, to build on that a little bit, we talked a little bit about limitation, and a lot of agencies have a no code requirement. We're really trying to move away from lines of code, proprietary code, and SaaS solutions out there that are low code, that are able to meet that need that Evan was talking about, those boutique experiences. You're seeing also a lot of development approaches move away from maybe traditional waterfall to agile, which is really meeting that MVP, race to MVP, sprints, fail fast, what's working and what's not. And I know some of our customers who are able to move to that and start to do that really well. We joke about the Chattanooga experience, which kind of packages it up a little bit. But I think that's a trend that you're
Yeah.
seeing with a lot of the workforce in the public sector space. If you think about the military, for instance, these are like Evan, maybe former pilots, and not everyone has that skill set. But if you're looking at a market rate, there's some folks can make a lot of money outside of the public sector space. You want to give them that same experience, the same ability to grow their career as one would in the private sector,
Hmm.
while also following very traditional agile development approaches.
Awesome. All right. So you can't just drop the Chattanooga experience, mid sentence and then move on like that. So let's park there for a second. So for those of you that are watching for the first time, Squid is headquartered out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. We love Chattanooga. It's a great town. It's a very tech savvy town. We were the first city in the Western Hemisphere to get gigabit internet. It's a great spot. So, what is the Chattanooga experience?
Yeah,
Ashleigh?
Evan and I are happy to have been part of that with some of our customers. It's really bringing disparate folks, disparate stakeholders into a room, into outside of their environment. Again, we're this concept of limitation almost in a way, less distraction, and going through and defining what MVP looks like. With the help of SaaS technologies like Squid, Salesforce, other ISV partners, to say, okay, this is what we need to get to. Help us get there, and doing that with from wireframe to a full proof of concept, and so doing that in a week in a lot of instances to help model what that looks like has been really rewarding, because we've seen then our customers go out and do that themselves, which a little mama bear and you're like, oh, this is great. But again, having that, I think when you're doing cross-functional work, depending on whoever the stakeholder is, it's really rewarding to see that come together in a final product or solution at the end.
Awesome. All right, Evan.
Oh yeah, especially I just like to add in particular, it's my old stomping grounds of the Air Force. They did see some of the art of the possible. No one knew you could turn Salesforce into a physical fitness app, right? Until we got to go in and see that develop. And go from one of the lowest rated applications that I definitely remember back in my day to, I believe it's now the second highest rated user score application in the entire Air
Awesome.
Force portfolio, of which is about 1,000 applications. So we got the Air Force group out there from the Pentagon, and in about 5 days, they got to see an application they thought would take a lot more lift. In that group of stakeholders included platform experts from Salesforce, systems integrators, everyone. And ultimately, everyone just wants to see the government succeed because they've paid for their product; they should get it, and that's what we really like to see. And a short day experience and a nice visit to Chattanooga.
Yeah, that's great, and let's marry the two concepts there, because we're talking about the Chattanooga experience, which is kind of it's basically a design kickoff, is what we're saying, getting all the right people in the room, cross functionally, but it doesn't stop there. And so you talked about the number of apps that are part of that. Like I think what we're seeing with Air Force is that you've got a great kickoff with the Chattanooga experience, making sure you're solving the right things, you're setting up the right targets, but then you're getting into that cycle that you were describing before, Evan, of ongoing experimentation, being able to test things quickly. And so now it's like, new module, like every month of new functionality that users need, very, very critical parts of just supporting the life of service members. So, but all of that together, what we're saying is that Air Force and other leaders in PubSec are creating space for human-centered design. And I think that's one of the things that we want to focus on here is because I don't know, I think people often hear design and they think, oh, that means like it looks pretty, and it's like that's when you have extra budget and time for the cosmetics. And so when we say human-centered design, what do we mean, and what does that look like in the context of PubSec leaders creating the time and space for it?
I'll start with another buzzword. It's keeping the human in the loop. It's human centric. So what you'll see is, partners that we've worked with before, starting with that user journey. What is the employee, what does the user need to do? Is it intuitive? Does it follow the same contrast? There's that design principle aspect of it. But again, always thinking a couple steps ahead, is this intuitive? Is this meeting the need of this person? And do it to perform the function of their job. And something that was incredibly rewarding to see, and a lot of the work that Evan described, is the UAT, to throw out another TLA, user accepted testing. To see the amount of testing that goes into what they think is MVP, or where they think pre-prod, et cetera, and to see then, okay, where do they need to make changes on the fly? And solutions like Squid and Salesforce allow them to do that, which is fantastic. But there's so much work that goes into an application development cycle that's outside of design, but still human-centered design, which I think is kind of what you're getting to a little bit.
Yeah, that's great, and that's a good TLA, I think. Well, and I think there's another point in there that is good to call out, which is this idea of kind of institutionalizing low-code development across a large organization. That the first wave of kind of low-code platforms like Salesforce, they got that to a certain point, but this next wave of new low-code application platforms, I think people are trying to figure out what that actually looks like, and I think that's what we're seeing PubSec lead the way in doing is figuring out how to do that at scale. And I think there's a lot of good lessons to be learned there. So there's another thing too, I think, in all of this, which is this idea of project management versus product management. So Evan, I don't know, have you seen much of this shift in the customers that you've worked with? What can you tell us about that kind of shift in mindset?
Yeah, ultimately, we've been seeing, and especially connecting that to human-centered design, is having that layer. And so when people picture products, as part of their project management, they see either that baseline tech or platform, or like I'm going on Salesforce or I'm going on ServiceNow. And that's the mindset I'm going to fit in to then manage this based on their best practices. Instead, with human-centered design, starting with the executive orders we saw from President Biden, these organizations are getting mandated to create a human-centered design layer where they have that UX layer that dictates the experience and how they're going to proceed with their project, instead of thinking, okay, I have this product and this is how we're going to work from there.
Interesting.
So,
Yeah. So the human centered layer, that's the thing that persists, and they focus on that. Yeah, and that's one of the things that we've seen at Squid is this idea of projects are completed, but products get managed. And so instead of just, finishing a project and all right, I'm done. I wash my hands of this. Let's move on. The idea is what you're saying is with that experience layer, that doesn't die. Like you deliver that and you keep adding value to it over time. And that's what we're seeing with Air Force is, there's a new module. There's this new thing that we need to be able to support, and they're able to continue to add to it because they're thinking of it as a product that they've created, that they've continued, as opposed to simply just an ecosystem that they're a part of, and then they go from project to project to project. Very cool. All right. Well, I think we're coming up on time here. So we've covered a good bit of ground today. We've talked about products. We've talked about process. We've talked about technology. We've talked about human-centered design. So let's just do a quick round. If listeners had 3 takeaways, what would you want them to walk away with? I'll start with Evan, and then Ashleigh. Let's top 3 takeaways for today.
I'm start with one going back to that UX layer in particular. When you talk about application design, in the perfect world where you had unlimited resources, your users are all drawing out exactly what they want, and then it executes from there. And what has happened now that human-centered design has been mandated by the government and organizations are being called out for not matching the minimum standards of accessibility and requirements, is that people are starting to think with those kind of front facing, okay, what do we need the user to accomplish quickly, efficiently, and go from here. And from there, then you can start looking at, whatever your resource limitations are or best practices of storage and that kind of thing to start flowing down the application from there. But let's just start with the human first, and let's start moving from there, get them on site, see what, they can provide when their imagination is more open versus saying, I have to sit in this suite of tools, and see what happens. And when you get these people and passionate stakeholders in one place, it turns up a lot of magic.
All right, human first or user first, technology second. All right, so that's one takeaway for today. Ashleigh, what's our second one?
I mentioned digital transformation versus digital translation. Digital translation might be the first step in your agile process, in your innovation, and that's okay. But we talked about agile management, failing fast, quick sprints, iterating, and that ultimately gets you to the digital transformation.
All right, awesome. All right, digital translation versus transformation. We need one more. Who's going to do it?
My OX overall is that the private sector isn't doing this. Public sector's ahead. We're seeing a lot of times they mass buy into a platform and they tell their users, hey, this is the new platform. It's replacing your old tool. Make it work. Here's 20 pages of instructions on how to figure out the tool. And instead, maybe take a book out and see how they're flexing these platforms to be consistent experiences across data sources, across tools. If you have one component that works one way, why shouldn't it work that way on another platform?
Awesome. All right.
That's the call out.
That's the opinion. Evan and Ashleigh have the experience. I think that's about time for today. So Thank you for listening. If you've enjoyed this or you want to engage, please give us a follow on LinkedIn. Give Evan, Ashleigh a follow on LinkedIn. We'd love to talk with you. And thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time on the Opinionated Experience.